All right, let's go ahead and kick things off. Hello, everybody. My name is Alex Smear. I'm the Advocacy Coordinator with 100 Miles. We're really excited to be partnering tonight with Defenders of Wildlife, the Georgia Conservancy, Southern Environmental Law Center, as well as all of you. A bit of housekeeping right now. I'm sharing my screen and I'll be flipping through the slides for our presenters. If you're joining us via Zoom, please keep your cameras off in order to keep that little camera window off of the screen. And please keep your Zoom or your phone line muted. If you have questions along the way, feel free to type them into the chat box if you're joining us on Zoom. And if you're joining us by phone, feel free to jot down your questions as we go along. We'll have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentations and a chance for all of us to hop on the call unmuted with our videos on, just to have a little bit of discussion. And of course, you can keep your videos off if you prefer to do that, but we definitely encourage you to ask questions. And finally, if you're joining us by calling in and not joining us by Zoom, I just want to note that you can follow along with the slides on Google Slides that was sent out in the email. There's a link to that in the email that I sent out earlier today. And with that, I'll introduce our speakers for tonight. We have Stephanie Chewning from 100 Miles, who will be covering the ecological and natural resource aspects of the swamp. Christian Hunt from Defenders of Wildlife will be explaining the global significance of this resource. We'll then hear from Charles McMillan to understand more about the threat of mining at hand. And finally, we'll hear from Bill Sapp and Bob Sherrier at SELC as they explain how we can take action and why we should take action. After that, like I said, we'll get into the Q&A portion, and we encourage all of you, as you're listening to the presenters, to make notes of any questions you have for them, as well as any notes of facts or interesting points that you want to include in your comments to the Army Corps of Engineers. The goal of tonight's webinar really is to ensure that everybody feels equipped with the knowledge and inspired to write meaningful comments to the Army Corps of Engineers to help protect the swamp, and ask that they deny the permit and require an EIS for Twin Pines. And with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Stephanie Chewning and she'll kick us off.
Well, thank you, Alex, for that introduction. So tonight, to know Okie is to love it. And my job is that if you don't already love and are fascinated by this place, is to start that fascination so you will also want to take action to protect it. So we're going to start with where Okefenokee is located, if you're unaware. It is located in the southeastern part of Georgia and also in the northern part of Florida. It's about 60 miles from the coast, and the total size of the swamp is 438,000 acres, or roughly half the size of the state of Rhode Island. This does make it the largest blackwater wetland in North America. And on top of that, 80% of this place is considered wilderness. There are three main entrances for visitors to get into the swamp. The most visited is the one on the eastern side, and that is run by the National Refuge System. On the north side, you have Okefenokee Swamp Park, and that is a privately run entrance. And then on the west, you have Stephen C. Foster State Park, which is run by Georgia DNR. Next slide. So tonight, we're really going to hear a lot about Trail Ridge, but Trail Ridge is an ancient barrier island that if it wasn't there, Okefenokee would never have been formed as it is today. So Trail Ridge is a 130-mile sand ridge on the eastern side of the swamp that extends from Jessup, Georgia to Stark, Florida. And like all barrier islands, they're formed over time by ocean, wind, and currents. This one formed about 100 million years ago during the Pleistocene epoch. Similar to today's island, one side was oceanfront, and then behind it was a marsh, lagoon, or estuarine system. This is where Okefenokee sits today. As the ocean started to recede, the water behind Trail Ridge was trapped. And this happened over a long period of time. In the Ice Age, the water started to recede further away, and slowly that lagoon changed from a marine habitat to a freshwater as the water was trapped. Also at the same time, mineral deposits and clay deposits started to fall out and form a thick layer under the sand that stopped water from seeping out that way as well. What was left behind was a large, shallow area where the average depth is only 2 feet, which is solely rain dependent. There are no major rivers or springs that help feed the water into the swamp. However, there are 2 rivers that flow out. The larger being the Suwannee River that flows into the Gulf of Mexico, and the second one is the St. Mary's, which flows into the Atlantic Ocean. Thus, this has created a variety of unique habitats. So Okefenokee Swamp is not the same where you go. It changes. The largest habitat found in the swamp is our flooded forest or cypress forest. This is about 50% of all of Okefenokee, filled with our cypress trees, both bald and pond cypress, as well as black guns and other type of water-loving trees. Followed by that are our shrub thickets. These are thick, dense areas full of tons of different types of shrubs like tie-tie, feather bush, vines, blueberries, tons of different things out there. The most popular or well-known habitat are probably the prairies, which is what dominates the eastern side of the swamp. So if you do go to the refuge entrance and take your canoes out, you're seeing these beautiful habitats. However, it's only 8% of the swamp is these prairies, and these are formed basically by lots of fires that open up these forests that are out there. Much smaller percentage of the swamp are the islands. So spread throughout the swamp are upland sand islands. That's only about 60%. And then where the swamp is deeper, there is about 60 lakes that have deeper water within them as well. So these diverse habitats lead to a diverse array of plants and animals. Next slide. This is just some of the numbers of the different types of plants and animals that call Okefenokee its home. Quite a array of different species live there, and we're going to focus a little more on a few of them that really make Okefenokee special. Next slide. So I'm going to start with longleaf pine. Longleaf pine used to be the dominant plant and forest here in the South. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with it. There used to be 90 million acres of longleaf pine here in the South. Now only 3% of it remains, and most of that is in protected areas like the Okefenokee. These are tall pine trees with long needles that can get up to 18 inches, hence where it got its name from. They're very adapted to fire, and they need fire for their life cycle. It helps get the competition out of the way and also adds much needed nutrients to the soil for their seedlings to grow up. And because of these vast habitats, other animals have also adapted to living in and among the longleaf pine. One of the most well-known is the gopher tortoise, also Georgia's state reptile. It is a keystone species, meaning that its lifestyle affects and allows for over 300 other species of animals to thrive as well. It does this by digging tunnels, or like a gopher, tunnels under the ground that other animals will feed in, will live in, will lay their own young, and some will even hunt in those areas. Another keystone species that uses the longleaf pines is the red-cockaded woodpecker. This is a woodpecker about the size of a cardinal, which is highly endangered and has a very special lifestyle that it uses the longleaf. It prefers living in live pines, unlike other type of woodpeckers that mostly live in dead species, but it does prefer very old or over 80-year-old pine trees to live in. That's because as these trees age, the middle or the hardwood in the center does get softer and makes a much more cushy nest for them. But because they build multiple cavities to live in, so they always have spare, other vertebrates have adapted to using those. So over 27 other types of vertebrates use their cavities as well. The other really interesting thing is because you have this large, vast area of water, shallow water, it also is very nutrient poor because of that we have many species of carnivorous plants that call the Okefenokee their home. There are 3 major varieties that live out there: the sundews, the bladderworts, and the pitcher plant. All have adapted to eating insects to get their nutrients since they are unable to get it out of the soil. And lastly, probably the species that most people relate to when they think of the Okefenokee is the American alligator. There are over 10,000, they believe, by doing counts, of them living out there at Okefenokee. But the reason they are so important to the biology of that area is that alligators, especially here in Georgia where it does get colder, build gator holes. They build these tunnels that are into the peat and into the sand underneath the water. They can be up to 8 feet deep. And this is really important for an area that is fully dependent on rainwater. So drought is a common condition and can happen quite often. So having these deeper areas where water can collect even during a drought, it allows fish and other freshwater animals to survive drought conditions, and also animals that rely, or land animals can have an area of fresh drinking water. So it makes it even more important that these animals are out there creating those habitats within the swamp. Next slide. So with having this great place to come, it also creates economic impact for the place around it. So many people want to come and see this special place that we have visitors from all 50 states, as well as countries around the world, which really impacts and creates local jobs, and the community around it really does benefit from having this area. Next slide. So the Okie has had an interesting history throughout time, and it has been used by it's been used by people, not just animals and plants through this time. We have data that Native Americans have been there since 500 AD in different cultures, but white settlers really came in the 1800s. And they were coming into this area to hunt and to feed and also to raise cattle and hogs. But even at this time, this was considered not really great land. It was a wasteland, it was full of bugs and snakes, and not a lot of people saw a lot of use for it at this time, which is what helped lead to the state of Georgia selling that land in 1891 to Captain Henry Jackson. And his idea, because he thought of it as a wasteland, was to drain the swamp. Fortunate for us today, he failed. He tried multiple times with convicts and mules and dynamite, but unfortunately did not do his homework and failed and went bankrupt in the process. So in 1901, the Herbert Cypress Company purchased the land, and they had a different method. They were just going to get what they could off the land, and they were able to cut down most of the virgin cypress that were out there. Next slide. Next slide, Alex. Okay, there you go. And you can see how they did this. They actually built the railroad right into the swamp, so it was easier to remove all of the hardwoods that were out there. And they pretty much decimated the swamp. Fortunately for us today, there was a group of naturalists that were out there documenting, researching, falling in love with the swamp we know and its many resources. And in 1929, the Georgia Society of Naturalists was formed by these people. One of them in particular was Francis Harper. He was the one who did a lot of that initial research. He was married to a woman named Jean Harper, and she happened to be the tutor to President Roosevelt's children when he was down here in Georgia. So she started to write letters to President Roosevelt, trying to encourage him to save this swamp, showing him in her letters why it was so important. Unfortunately, it took many letters, but eventually by 1937, Roosevelt was convinced that this was an area to protect, and he made it a national wildlife refuge by executive order. Next slide. So since that time, many people in America have also realized and discovered the importance and the wonders of Okefenokee. These are just a few of the designations the swamp has received here in the United States. But now I'm going to pass it on to Christian Hunt from the Defenders of Wildlife, and he will continue with the global significance of Okefenokee.
Thanks, Stephanie, for laying that foundation. Hey guys, my name's Christian, glad to be here. I'm just going to provide a little more context about sort of the global state of wetlands and sort of where the Okefenokee fits into this larger picture, because as you guys probably know, the state of wetlands at this point is pretty alarming. In the past 4 decades, we've lost around 35% of global wetlands. And that's very problematic because, you know, 1 billion people depend upon wetlands for drinking water, but also because 40% of all species live and breed within these wetland ecosystems. I think we're pretty fortunate in this day and age that there does seem to be some growing recognition of the importance of these ecosystems. And sort of when you zoom out and look at this from a larger scale, more or less on every continent that has wetland ecosystems, there's typically one or two sort of superlative examples of large scale, healthy, and relatively unimpaired wetland ecosystems. And, you know, when we head south in South America, slide please, that place is the Pantanal. And you guys may have seen documentaries on this place. It's very rich in jaguars, giant river otters, those sorts of animals. In Asia, that place is called the Sundarbans. It's actually one of several important wetland ecosystems out there. But in the next photo, it has a tiger in it because the Sundarbans is actually sort of world renowned for the fact that, unfortunately, that population of tigers seems to still have a predilection for hunting people. If you head over to Africa, that place is the Okefenokee. It's really rich in elephants, lions, hippos, and that's sort of the place where a lot of those docu-series have been filmed recently. But, you know, here in North America, I would argue that we still have really one or two large-scale wetlands of significance. Next slide, please. And, you know, one is, of course, the Everglades. And, you know, the Everglades is kind of an interesting case study, right? Because in the past several decades, we've spent over $3 billion in restorative efforts trying to bring the Everglades back to its original function. And it is still a place that's rich in wildlife. It is still one of our great natural places. But, you know, since the 1950s, the Everglades has lost 90% of its wading bird life. And that's mainly due to the fact that the hydrological regime has been altered. You know, the way that water moves and is stored within the Everglades has been compromised. And the interesting thing about the Okefenokee, on the other hand, is when you compare and contrast, the Okefenokee still sort of exists as it has for millennia. You know, it's still healthy, it's self-sustaining, it functions as it always has. So we don't have to invest billions of dollars in restoring this place because it hasn't been permanently compromised yet. And that's part of the reason that why out of 568 national wildlife refuges here in America, the Okefenokee is likely to be the first to earn UNESCO World Heritage Site status. And that's sort of the gold standard for designations for natural areas, internationally speaking. And here in the United States, some of the places that already enjoy that designation are the Redwoods, Grand Canyon, Smokies, really the best of the best. So the Okefenokee is right up there. This place is, however, threatened, which is, of course, why we're all here today. And that's because the Trail Ridge, which is that sliver of land paralleling the refuge, is an ancient sand dune that is rich in titanium mineral deposits. Now, these deposits are not especially rare. They're actually found throughout the southeastern coastal plain. But the reason that the Okefenokee has been targeted in the past and is again, is because it's easily accessible. It's near a railroad. The refuge is near a port in Jacksonville, so it's convenient for the mining industry. And several parcels directly next to the refuge, moreover, are privately held, which is the primary reason why we're continuing to deal with this challenge today, which is the prospect of titanium mining, which, if Twin Pines has its way in time, will likely come within about 400 feet of the swamp itself, which Charles McMillan of the Georgia Conservancy is gonna jump into more next. So take it away, Charles.
Well, thank you very much, Christian. You guys have laid a really good background. I am going to go into a little bit of the nitty gritty of what's in this application and zero in on Twin Pines, the current application, and then some of the specifics related to Trail Ridge. And the hydrology of Trail Ridge is commensurate with and just about as complicated as the hydrology for the Everglades, and you'll understand that in a few minutes after I finish telling you a little bit about it. Most of you are not very familiar with Trail Ridge, and our purpose today was to make sure that you had some basic understanding of it when you leave the meeting today. It's that funny little bump in southeast Georgia that goes down where our state dips down into Florida. That's formed by Trail Ridge and the St. Mary's River. The proposed Twin Pines mine is down in that area. It shows up as the red spot there on the right and a red dot on this next slide. The mine application to the Corps of Engineers by Twin Pines has the potential to impact three important ecological features in Georgia. One is the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. The other is the St. Mary's River, which, as you can see, is actually on both sides of the mine. 1/3 of the mine drains into the northern fork of the Okefenokee, which discharges, is a tributary to the Okefenokee. And then the main stem of the St. Mary's comes out of that. The other 2/3 of the proposed mining site application that's in right now drains into Boone Creek, which is on the west side of the tract. We're going to focus a lot today on Trail Ridge. The people, wildlife, plants, and water of this ridge is threatened by this mining site. One of the reasons that we're focusing so much on the Okefenokee is because we do not understand the degradation or larger threats that might occur to the Okefenokee as part of this mining and this first phase of the mining and future phase. The map, so now we're, if you would go into the next slide, please. This map shows you a little bit of context. One thing that a lot of times we don't spend a lot of time talking about is the Osceola Wildlife Management Area, which is a large 190,000 acre national forest, which is hydrologically, ecologically, and contiguous with the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. So you see the impact of this system in northern Florida and southeast Georgia. Trail Ridge does play a part on that. The mining that has occurred on the Florida side of Trail Ridge near Stark, Florida, has really had a lot of environmental issues, a lot of unintended consequences, water draining area, wetlands, and impacts of poor restoration after the mining occurs. It's just set a very bad precedent. And to the specter of those same mining companies or some of their later, some of the reincarnation of these mines and then going north along Trail Ridge on the Georgia side, especially getting so close to the Okefenokee, is just a real concern. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service defines Trail Ridge as that rim or morphological dam, the east side of the swamp, maintaining the hydrology of the swamp. The soil of the ridge has a profile or distinct layers. This gives it water handling, water holding, and water movement characteristics. Today, I'm going to talk a good bit about Trail Ridge. A lot of you are used to hearing comments related to wetlands, and typically we focus on species, surface water impacts, plants and animal impacts. Well, those are very much a part of this application, but when you understand how Trail Ridge works, you come to a better understanding of what the impacts could be to the plants, animals, and surface runoff from that. So this is you're not going to be a hydrogeologist when you get done with this meeting today, but you're at least going to understand some of the basic principles of what's involved. This is the concept model that is the current concept model that Twin Pines has used, and this is basically you would have if this was a slice of cake, you would be looking at the sides of the slice of cake. And you'd have the different layers. It's a sand profile primarily interspersed with humates and clays. And it's 75 to 100 feet thick. That forms the superficial aquifer, maybe a little bit deeper than that, going down to the hawthorn, which is a confining layer. This conceptual model is very close because this is what Twin Pines based their very detailed computer analysis on. And next slide, please. Now this is how their output looked. This is a very simplified. This is the version when they went through all their computer analysis. They came out with this is the way based on the borings. This is how we think the soil characteristics are going to, this is how we think that the Trail Ridge works. And so our concern has been, okay, when you take all this, and I think that you'll see an exhibit on this next. Go ahead, go to the next slide. This is exciting because I think these are out of order. Oops, looks like we're missing a couple of slides. Go back if you would. On the left side, you have the swamp. And that's about elevation 120. On the right side, what's missing out of their concept model is that it's much lower over to the right. It's the St. Mary's River is at elevation maybe 20. So you have about 100-foot gradient across Trail Ridge where you're going from the swamp, which is very high, and they explained why it's high, down to the St. Mary's River. Now you're going to dig into this, these different layers of sand, slowly churning through and mining it. And when you put back, it's going to be an homogenized, in other words, it's like taking that layered cake, putting it in a blender, and then putting it back in place and hoping that that blended material has the same kind of hydraulic characteristics. So literally, we're trying to figure out if this study, which we've been given a copy of, but we think that this study would benefit from going through an EIS process, an environmental impact statement process, where it would be independently reviewed by a geohydrologist to assess that the boundaries are correct and that all the assumptions are correct. One thing you'll notice from the east-west profile of their cross-section here from their computer output is that it does not begin at the swamp and it does not go over to the river. It only includes a short section in the middle of the ridge. If you would go to the next slide. So basically, this is the 898 acre site that they're proposing for this first phase of the mine. Each different color that you see, year 1 through 6, they would go back and forth, and it was like mowing a yard. They would be going across in a 100-foot wide mining pit that would be excavated by a drag line going back and forth across the site. What's notable about this approach is that they are plowing right through wetlands and streams. About 50% of this site is wetlands. So 400 acres of, and this is what you see on this next slide, that blue triangle, that blue rectangle is the phase one of this tract. So they're going back and forth, like you're mowing grass, going back and forth through wetlands and streams, and then replacing it after they've removed 2 or 3% of the material to get the mineralized compounds out of it. On this particular map that you see here, it's the heavy line that you see following the ridge, north-south. That's where the heavy minerals are primarily located. And this first phase, which shows up here as being the Keystone Tract, Twin Pines controls this overall area, which is about 12,000 acres. So as you can see, they're going to proceed. Later phases of the project would go north up towards this Longleaf Tract, so if it takes them 6 years to do that first property, they're going to be working next to the swamp for the next, I don't know, 30, 40 years. So our concern is also that as they dig down, which would be an average of about 50 feet, go back and forth, and keep in mind, they're going counter to the gradient. The grades on this ridge run parallel north-south. They're going east-west. So their approach does not necessarily work with the contours. If they were farmers, they would not be contour farming. They're going up and down, vice versa. So the whole thing has a lot of details like the wetlands restoration and the impacts to the swamp that we just are not real clear on. I'm more than happy to take questions. We're presenting 1,000 pages of information in an hour to you. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Mr. Bill Sapp from the Southern Environmental Law Center to give us the who, where, what, when, and how of making an effective comment to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Thanks, Charles. One thing I'm going to do is start off with a fun fact, and that is that this 12,000 acre mine is larger than St. Simon's Island. So, so that's an interesting way to think about the size and scope of this project. Now, my role here is pretty easy, because if you've dialed into this webinar, you probably have filed a comment already. I mean, I'm sure Jim Stokes and Esther Stokes and Kelly Jordan have all done that. But so I'll be talking mostly to the folks that haven't filed a comment. But as far as comments are concerned, you're looking at the guy you're writing your comment to. His name is Colonel Hibner. And it's kind of interesting because Colonel Hibner was a combat engineer. He is the first combat engineer that has served in a military district. And he's a good guy. I've met him and talked to him. But essentially your comments are going to go to him. And what you're going to be trying to do is convince Colonel Hibner that there isn't enough information. So he needs to deny the permit. I mean, I think it's important for everyone to realize that the burden of proof is on Twin Pines. They have to prove that the mine will not adversely impact the swamp. So that's the burden. If Colonel Hibner, decides that he doesn't want to deny the permit, but he's not comfortable granting it, he may well say, we need an EIS. And Bob Sherry is going to go into this a little bit more, but essentially an EIS is a whole group of studies that are done by a third party. Essentially, the Corps of Engineers says, Twin Pines, we need an EIS. The Corps then goes out and finds a consultant to actually do all the studies. And then Twin Pines has to pay for the EIS, which is a pretty good deal for all of us. So those are the two things you're going to be trying to convince Colonel Hibner of. Either deny the permit or require an EIS. Now, the comments themselves are anything from a 90-page, basically a 90-page brief, like the one SCLC is getting ready to turn in, or a 5-line email message. And this slide right here gives you an indication of what sort of things you should put in that email. The first thing is who you are, where you're from, and then your relationship to the Okefenokee. I go camping there, I go fishing there, I want to go there. You basically just go through and talk about your connection with the Okefenokee Swamp. And then the next thing you could talk about is the risks that you're aware of to the swamp. You know, how the mine might change the groundwater and cause the groundwater or the water levels in the Okefenokee Swamp to change. You know, so that's something. Now, you don't have to have proof of it. You just need to say that's something that I think might happen. And then the last thing you would say is, hey, you know, we don't have enough information now. There's so many scientists that are saying different things about groundwater flow and all that, again, you need to deny the permit, or you've got to get more studies done, and Corps of Engineers, you have to do an EIS. So, Alex, the next slide. And you have a deadline for getting that email message together. It's May 28th. And you need to send it to the address in blue. And we'll make sure that you don't have, well, you don't have to write it down right now, but we'll make sure you have that before you leave the webinar. But that will go straight to the Army Corps of Engineers. And essentially what the Corps of Engineers has to do with all the comments that come in is respond to them. And, you know, we had in the Clean Water Rule, there were 1 million comments. And the Corps of Engineers, or the EPA in that case, had to respond in some way to those comments. In this case, we've generated close to 40,000 comments, which is unheard of for Georgia. I can't think of a single project that has even come close to that. But the Corps of Engineers is going to have to answer all those comments. And again, the reason you're commenting, and even if you're saying here, okay, they already got 40,000 comments, we need more. We need to make it abundantly clear that the public is interested in getting more information concerning this mine. There is so much confusion about whether the hydrology connects the way some experts say, and so that controversy is something that can only be answered by an EIS. And that's why we're pushing for one. And the other reason your comments are important is if we have to go to court over this project, it'll be good to be able to say we have 45,000 individuals who, you know, felt this way about the mine, and that can be persuasive. And we always push in all of our cases to get as many comments as we can. It just happens in this case we have a ton of them, but we need more. So please send an email in to the address you see on the screen. And I know a lot of you have done that. Like Tally Sweat, she's on the list of people you know, listening to this webinar. I'm sure she's done it, and I'm sure a lot of others on the list have done it. But again, it's very important And if we're effective in what we're doing with these comments, we won't have to get to the next stage, which is litigation. And that's where I'm going to turn it over to Bob Sherrier, who is an associate attorney with SELC. So take it away, Bob.
Thanks, Bill. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk briefly about NEPA and the EIS that Bill was talking about, and a little bit of what a court challenge under that statute looks like. It's also one of the key decisions that the Corps has to make coming up after the comment period closes. NEPA stands for the National Environmental Policy Act, and it has kind of two key functions. First, it requires the agency to consider the environmental impacts of any action that it takes. The second function is just as important. It requires the agency to inform the public about those impacts and convince them that it's considered them adequately. NEPA is a procedural statute. It's one of several that the Corps has to comply with here. And the procedural in this context means that they could do a full EIS, get to the end, and the EIS shows that this is going to drain the swamp, but NEPA itself wouldn't prevent the Corps from granting the permit. Other acts would have to do that, like the Clean Water Act. The first bullet point is about an EIS. It's the standard from the statute itself. The function of an EIS is that it's a detailed look at the impacts of the project by a third party. And that's all the impacts that Charles described, including the groundwater, as well as noise in the wilderness area, air quality, every environmental impact, human impacts you can think of. Sometimes the Corps can do what's called an EA, or an environmental assessment, to determine whether there are any significant impacts that require an EIS. And EAs and EISs serve very different functions that way. The EA evaluates the significance of the impacts, and the EIS takes a close look at what they're going to be. If the Corps decides not to do an EIS, it's going to have to make a finding of no significant impact. And it's going to do that in a document laying out the reasons that the Corps thinks there's not going to be any significant impacts. That document can be challenged in court, and a judge would look at the Corps' reasons under what's known as the arbitrary and capricious standard. It basically just looks at if the Corps made a reasonable decision and backed it up. One of the strange things about this standard is that the judge can think the Corps got the wrong answer, but if they think the Corps got a reasonable answer, then it still survives. And so this is where comments come in, is that the Corps, in making a finding of no significant impact, has to respond to all the comments and has to independently verify all the answers that Twin Pines gives them for those comments. And so when you challenge a FONSI, as they're known, you can only challenge issues that you raised in comments to the Corps. And so that's why it's so important that we hear from a diverse set of voices who can raise all the different kinds of impacts the Corps should consider at this stage. I'm happy to answer questions with the rest of our time, and I will pass it back to Alex to facilitate that. Thanks.
Thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you, Bob. I appreciate y'all bearing with me as I was admitting people in and being eager with your slides, but we are all learning still and adapting to this virtual life that we have found ourselves in. That was such a great variety of presentations and materials, and I think we can all find something to write about in our comments based off that presentation. Now I want to turn it over to you guys. If you, all the attendees, if you are interested in asking questions, we have this is just a list of, I need to mention, it's not just these 4 organizations working on this issue in Georgia. There are a lot of organizations working on this issue, and these are just some of them. But now we're going to turn it over to questions. And so if y'all want to take yourselves off mute or utilize the chat box, we did have one question come in, and Bill, you may be able better to answer this. Has anyone from the St. Mary's Riverkeeper been involved, specifically any of their board members? So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
That is an interesting question. In fact, we'll be talking to the St. Mary's Riverkeeper in the next day or so to see where they, what position they are taking.
This is Chip Campbell, sitting here with Joy Campbell. Laws, St. Mary's Riverkeeper has been involved in these conversations all along. The presentation that was basically given here pretty well encapsulates the concerns that we've talked about and are reflected in the comments that we have made to the Corps twice now. So I hope that's helpful in answering that question.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you, Chip.
I will have to say Chip and Joy were helpful when we first got involved, before we even knew about specifically where Twin Pines was located. He and I, this is Charles McMillan, we attended a briefing and we were, so he and I were, and Joy were some of the folks that were early on briefed by Twin Pines on some of this. Since then, the concept for the mine has moved around some, but a lot of the issues remain the same. It's all about the resource.
Hey, Alex, I got, this is Alice Kaiser, 100 Miles, but I got an email question from someone asking about whether Twin Pines Minerals has identified and shared with the public what would indicate a successful demonstration project, and will they have third-party monitoring throughout the demonstration?
That's a good question. Does anybody want to take that? Any of our presenters? Bob?
Yeah, I think the general answer to that is no. They have not offered third-party monitoring. The application does mention kind of vague monitoring plans, but it doesn't set any real standards that they're going to judge the results by. And that's one of the deficiencies in the application itself that we point out in our comments.
So that's something that other people could include in their comments as well.
Yeah.
Another question came in the chat that if people have already commented on the application, the previous application, should they comment again?
Yes, definitely. I mean, this is a second round of comments. It is a new application, so they should definitely send in another comment. And it's interesting, we got, I think by the Corps count, 22,000 on the first go around, and now we're approaching 40,000 on the second application. So definitely comment on this second round.
Okay, wow, I'm trying to keep up. So another participant wants to know 3 of the most important points that we can make in our comments to the Corps. Top 3. Let's hear one ecological one from, Stephanie's like, oh no. I want to take it back to the global significance. And I think that, I'm going to butcher it, but the UNESCO designation is really important that Christian talked about. Do you want to highlight that again, quickly emphasize that point, Christian?
Sure, yeah. I mean, UNESCO designations are reserved for the last sort of unspoiled, intact, superlative areas that in many cases are still rich in wildlife. So I think ecologically speaking, aside from the hydrology and all that, it's important to touch upon the fact that this refuge, as Stephanie pointed out, has thousands of species. I mean, it might have over 1,000 species of moths alone. So it's one of sort of those last great places. The rivers it burrs is home to multiple endangered species, such as a relic population of Atlantic sturgeon in the St. Mary's River, which are impacted by sedimentation and development. So the Okefenokee is also home to wood stork, gopher tortoise, eastern indigo snakes, sort of those species that are emblematic of what once was throughout a lot of the Southeast. So I think it's critical to speak to that fact that this is sort of one of those last great habitats for these species that have declined across their entire range.
Yeah, I just want to bring back that there was a slide omitted, but Charles had a slide showing the cross section that if we start messing with taking out the substance in Trail Ridge and then we try to put it back in, the hydrology that those species Christian's talking about are so reliant on may not have the hydrology and the same habitat that they needed previously in order to thrive in the Okefenokee. 2 other points. I know Bill has the 2 points, or one of the lawyers wants to have the 2 main points that need to be in the comments. Can you repeat those? So just 2
as far
points.
as the 2 main points, I think the one that is, central to all of this is that there's still so much controversy between the scientists and between, the people, the public that are writing in comments. And that controversy can only be solved by the preparation of an EIS.
So deny the permit, get an EIS if we can, and then try to emphasize the ecological significance and how just pristine the swamp really is and unique. Someone asked, how much influence do local politicians have upon the Army Corps' decision? Does anybody want to take that?
I'll speak to that. They can have, a significant amount of influence depending on who is in that position as, the colonel of the Savannah district. So, that's something to always keep in mind. And then Colonel Hibner may well be influenced by the general above him. So it's definitely something to keep in mind as we move through this, and we're always cognizant of that type of influence.
And you don't have to utilize the chat function. If y'all want to chime in with questions, you can do that as well.
What is the email address to send comments?
Yeah, let me go back to sharing that screen again. So we will send this, all this information out in an email for you guys tomorrow, and we'll have everything clickable so you can send stuff. If you are accessing this via Google Slides, you can also just click the link and it would pop up a email.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh. Okay, someone asked if this is in Representative Buddy Carter's district. I believe it is, but I'm gonna see if Alice or Charles can confirm that.
It's in Buddy Carter's district.
It is.
Yes, it's in Buddy Carter's district, and there have been several conversations that that I have had with the staff, and I know a lot of other people have reached out to him, asking him to weigh in on the importance of the swamp and the value that it brings to the people in his district and to him. So
Al Lawson from Florida has weighed in a little bit more and has written a letter and been involved. I think that Florida's seen so much of the impact over the years that they're maybe a little bit more cautious about some of that.
Okay, and the next question from Todd is, do you know if anyone has done a photo documentary on the difference between the current wonderful conditions on Trail Ridge near Okefenokee as compared to the current desolate conditions near the mines on Trail Ridge near Stark, Florida, where mining has been operating for decades?
Todd,
Familiar.
thank you. That's a great question. I will tell you this, just cruising up and down in Google Earth is what I've done. But we have not done any serious scientific studies between those two. But for everybody that's on the call, basically, if you look between Stark, Florida and I-10, you can see exactly where Trail Ridge is because it's like a moonscape. So the answer is no, other than very informally on Google Earth.
Okay. Someone asked about the form letters that are on 100 Miles website as well as some other websites. You can use the form letter links and we'll send those out. So if you don't feel prepared after sitting through the webinar to write your own comments, you can use those links to send in comments that have already been written. But we are working with the Corps to ensure that those comments are counting. So it is always best to send your own comments from your own personal email address to ensure that they do not get filed as a form email. We want to make sure that it's as personalized as possible so the Corps can't dispute anything coming in as a form letter and only being counted once.
It's going the wrong way up there.
Okay, and then we have just like a few more minutes. So someone asked, when is it time to send letters to federal legislators, the governor and DNR commissioner and state legislators?
Now.
I think that's a fair answer.
Yeah, I mean, this is Bill. I would say definitely now. I mean, this comment period ends on the 8th. The Corps of Engineers is going to be responding to the comments. They're either going to be drafting an EA on the road to issuing a permit or making a decision to require an EIS. So please, in addition to commenting to the Corps of Engineers, write your, person from the General Assembly or from Congress or the Senate, and let them know how you feel too.
Also, just to add that related to the DNR commissioner, the Coastal Resources Division has to issue a letter of compliance of the federal coastal laws that they oversee at the state level. And so they will be weighing in, and but we know that another branch of the Department of Natural Resources is the Environmental Protection Division, and they will be weighing in on this as well. So Coastal Resources Division and EPD both have a role to play in the finalization of any project of this nature.
Okay, so I don't see any other questions coming in, but that leads me to just one final clarification point that I want to make is, this is really for, I think, the attorneys. Is this the final step before litigation, or are there other agencies like Fish and Wildlife Service that would need to weigh in? Or is this really, the final step before they can get
going? Twin Pines needs more permits than just the one from the Corps. This would be the first of several permits. They need groundwater withdrawal permits from EPD. They need a surface mining permit from EPD, several other water discharge permits. So there are a number of steps before the project before they can first start digging into the ground.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Well, with that, we are out of time, but that just leads me to the point that we don't want to keep this going, even though they are going to have to get permits in the future if they do want to proceed with this. it is much more effective if we can band
Shut
together
it
and
down.
have meaningful comments now to stop this project here and keep it from moving forward. So with that, I want to encourage y'all to take what you learned here tonight. We'll send a video out tomorrow if you want to review it again before you submit your comments, and make note of what is really meaningful to you about the swamp, so that when the Army Corps reads these comments that we're sending in, they have a lot to consider and a lot to sift through, so that they acknowledge that the Okefenokee Swamp and Wildlife Refuge is an important place to all of us. With that, please just keep in mind you can email any of us at any time. Our emails are on the first page, and I'm sure our presenters would be happy to answer questions at any time. But I'm going to sign us off for now, so y'all have a good night.
Good job.
How long?